Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 81 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to order of reference of Tuesday, September 26, 2023, the committee meets to discuss its study on Bill C-33, an act to amend the Customs Act, the Railway Safety Act, the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, 1992, the Marine Transportation Security Act, the Canada Transportation Act, and the Canada Marine Act, and to make consequential amendments to another act. Today's meeting is taking place, colleagues, in a hybrid format pursuant to the order of the House of Thursday, June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person and joining us using the Zoom application. Colleagues, appearing before us for the first hour today, we have from the Canada Border Services Agency, Graham Hamilton, Director General, Travel, Commercial and Trade Policy. Welcome. Kathy Toxopias, Director General, Transformation, Planning and Projects. Welcome to you as well. From the Department of Transport, nous avons Monsieur Serge Bijamin, Assistant Deputy Minister Policy, Lisa Setlakwi, Assistant Deputy Minister Safety and Security. Welcome. Sonia Reid, Director General Marine Policy, and Stephen Scott, Director General Rail Safety. Witnesses, welcome on behalf of the committee. We will dive right into it, and I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Hamilton for your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee this afternoon. As introduced, I'm Graham Hamilton, Director General, Traveller, Commercial and Trade Policy at the Canada Border Services Agency, and I'm here to speak to specifically to the changes to the Customs Act included in Bill C-33. I'm joined again this afternoon by my colleague Kathy Toxopias, Director General, Transformation, Planning and Projects Directorate. I will maybe perhaps turn it over to Mr. Bijamin, who will provide remarks on behalf of the entire panel, if that is acceptable.
That works for us.
Over to you, happy to do that. And just wanted to make sure if folks can hear me with the microphone.
I don't see anybody saying otherwise, so the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. And I did hear someone from the committee say that they will go easy on us, so we're looking forward to that. But thank you very much for l'occasion de comparaître devant le comité.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. You did a good job, Mr. Chair, of introducing the people that will be here with us on the panel to answer questions. Essentially, I will be speaking, and we will be speaking about Bill C-33, an act to improve Canada's port system and security system.
Two mode-specific reviews launched by Transport Canada in 2017 and 2018. The first one, the Railway Safety Act review, and the second one was the Port Modernization review. Now, with both reviews completed and lessons learned from the past year, including the pandemic, we are positioned to modernize the tools used by government, railways, and ports. As you said, the bill does contain reforms to 6 Act, the Customs Act, the Railway Safety Act, the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, the Marine Transportation Security Act, the Canada Transportation Act, and the Canada Marine Act. Now, with respect to the proposals in this bill that are aimed at strengthening the rail safety and security regime in Canada, these proposals are meant to do a few things. One, provide Transport Canada with the explicit authority to consult with any interested party on a proposed rule. Second, foster the testing of new technologies to serve to enhance the efficiency of the rail network. Third, introduce compliance tools to the regulatory regime. Fourth, something quite minor but important, broaden the definition of safety to include security. Fourth, allow for the introduction of transportation security clearances in the rail sector. They already exist in the aviation sector. We want to bring them into the rail sector. And lastly, prohibit dangerous or unruly behavior on board trains or at station and prohibit unlawful interference with railway operation. So that's what the rail safety and security side of the bill is meant to do. Du côté maritime, on parle des ports.
On the marine side, reforms would provide government and Canada Port authorities with enhanced tools to improve governance and operational performance, and to support a secure marine transportation environment. In 1998, the Canada Marine Act established the current Canada Port Authorities governance structure. Bill C-33 presents the first opportunity in 25 years to reform Canada's port system to meet the needs of Canadians today and in the future. Presenting a once-in-a-generation opportunity, this legislation would do 6 things. First, it would reposition ports as strategic gateways critical to the efficiency of national supply chains and transform them into data and analytical hubs. Second, modernize tools to enhance the minister's ability to consider the impact of port investments on Canada's gateways. Third, facilitate Fourth, enhance the port responsiveness to management and local issues. Next, advance the government's reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples. And next, buttress Canada's climate change commitments. And finally, support a resilient transportation system that is safe and secure.
Experience supply chain challenges and the associated economic impact firsthand, including the COVID-19 pandemic, extreme climate events, and change in trade patterns. These repeated stresses have tested Canada's transportation system and have underscored the importance of supply chain resiliency going hand in hand with system resiliency. This bill, Bill C-33, proposes to serve as a first step, almost a down payment, for a national transportation supply chain strategy. En terminant, je tiens à souligner que
In closing, I would like to say that Bill C-33 is determined to improve competitiveness and the efficiency of Canada's supply chains and advance a transportation system that is safe, secure, and resilient. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you for your opening remarks. We'll now turn it over to questioning, and we'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. We had certainly hoped that Minister Rodriguez would be made available to lead us off for this this study on Bill C-33. We understand he's coming much later, but unfortunately, he's not here to lead off the discussion. But we appreciate the officials being here. Obviously, our concern with the bill is that it appears to, and it does, increase Ottawa's influence in the port system, specifically with the minister's appointment of the chair, which used to be done by the board of directors at the ports. That's now been taken over by the minister. So a bit of an Ottawa knows best attitude here, and part of the concern that I have heard from port users and port authorities and others that are impacted by this legislation has to do with that, has to do with the made in Ottawa solutions to, a solution in search of a problem, to be quite honest. And I'm sure we'll get into that more as we debate this and propose amendments and critiques over the next number of meetings. But I want to get into specifically some of the issues at the Port of Vancouver. One of the primary issues that has been raised, or an issue that has become an increasing concern, is the lack of available anchorages for marine vessels coming into and out of the port to safely anchor and wait for their turn to load or unload. They use anchorages, and because of backups in the supply chain, they're using some anchorages that haven't been used all that often over the last number of decades. But this bill really does provide, in my view, an opportunity to shut down some of those anchorages. And as we're expanding port capacity and looking to increase vessel traffic to improve economic outcomes for Canadians, to improve on the supply chain, this bill provides a mechanism to shut down anchorages, which was kind of like building a bigger shopping mall and reducing the parking lot is how it's been described to me. So why does Bill C-33 provide for more gatekeepers to shut down more anchorages when in fact we need every anchorage that's available, and some are suggesting we even need more?
And thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So what I can say to that is that as currently written, the bill does not aim to shut down anchorages. However, the bill does want to provide additional power to the port to direct traffic. And by being able to provide power to direct traffic, we're hoping that the port could get to a place where, by managing traffic more efficiently and managing what goes into the port more efficiently and managing the railways that come into the port more efficiently, the need for anchorages, as we saw, will likely go down. The more we increase the fluidity and the efficiencies of the system, the less those will be needed. But there is no plan to shut it down.
Okay, well, one of the things that keeps vessels at anchorage instead of at the port and instead of loading or unloading is the fact that the Port of Vancouver is one of the only jurisdictions, if not the only jurisdiction in the world that I'm aware of, that cannot load cannot load grain in the rain. This is a long time problem that has come as a result of safety concerns. But other ports that have the same safety concerns on the west coast of North America have managed to come up with a way to load grain in the rain. It rains here. It's raining here today in British Columbia. It rains about 170 days a year. So how is it that this bill doesn't provide for a solution to loading grain in the rain when that is such a barrier to supply chain efficiency at the Port of Vancouver?
And separate from the bill, we've been engaging with stakeholders in Vancouver around the safety issues related to loading grain in the rain. And we continue to work with the stakeholders, the port, on this very specific issue to try to get to a solution that will allow some of these activities to continue, but in a safe and secure manner. The safety and security of the workforce always comes first. And I was just looking and figuring out the right balance to reach the best solution possible. And those discussions are happening. They're taking place. Transport Canada is also right in the middle of it with the various stakeholders. So we didn't feel it was necessarily something that should be addressed in the bill. It's something that's a safety issue that's typically addressed outside of the bill through discussions with
Thank
the
you very
various
much.
stakeholders.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Stroll. We'll go to our next line of questioning from Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses today. First of all, this supply chain issue, of course, has been an ongoing discussion for many years, and we've heard from many different witnesses about how to try to improve our ports and railways to continue to create efficiencies and for the future. And as our country's population grows, of course, it becomes an even bigger problem. There's more demand for product. So I'll ask the officials, can you tell us a bit about the work of the Supply Chain Task Force and for the benefit of the committee and people watching this session, and maybe how it influenced the bill that we're now studying?
Sure thing. That's a great question. So the Supply Chain Task Force report came out, I believe, last October. And they had a series of 21 recommendations in total. And I think one in particular was around port and the role they play in the supply chain. And what we did when we received the report, we were right in the middle of writing our what we heard report for the port modernization review that had started back in 2018. So what we did is we incorporated elements of the supply chain task force report and basically came out with another report that laid out 5 key streams of work. The first one was competitiveness. So how do we support the competitiveness of Canada's economy by facilitating the movement of goods? And this bill attempts to do that. Second was strengthening relationship with Indigenous peoples and local community. And this bill attempts to do that as well. And third was around promoting environmentally sustainable infrastructure and operation, and this bill attempts to do that as well, and enhances sport safety and security and optimizing governance and financial management. So all that to say that the work we're doing through Bill C-33 is really a down payment on the upcoming National Transportation Supply Chain, and the National Supply Chain Task Force report is a report that we often use to feed the policies and the regulations that we're hoping to develop and the strategy we're hoping to develop in the coming months.
So is it fair to say that of these 21 recommendations from that particular report, a fair number of these have been incorporated into Bill C-33?
I'd say some of them have been incorporated, and others have been incorporated in other avenues as well. So we don't have the specific number, but we're happy to do a side-by-side and
Yes.
provide you with the information of what was implemented where and which form.
Would appreciate that for sure. C-33 in a few different places throughout the bill adds reporting requirements on ports. So what kind of data is government looking for, and how might it be used?
I'll turn to my colleague, Sonia Reed.
Hi. So there's a number, as you noted, a number of provisions that implement new reporting requirements. Broadly, the proposals that establish data collection are intended to support improvements to marine traffic management and port operational efficiency. So that would be the first tranche of data requirements. In respect of the additional reporting requirements, there's, I would say, practically speaking, 3 broader reporting requirements. The first around financial reporting, so requirements around the quarterly financial reports and an annual financial report for the port authorities to improve financial transparency and accountability. The second is regarding reporting around their land use planning on a regular basis to ensure that land use plans are public and updated on a regular basis for the benefit of community and local stakeholders as well as the broader community. And the third is reporting to support better transparency in respect of climate change and the port activities in respect of meeting GHG emissions targets as well as adaptation strategies.
So we as a committee, we did some travel and covered some ports on the east coast of the country and on the west coast, of course, the major ports. And we've been told by different groups that data collection and digitization and on are important elements of future efficient ports. But we've heard, of course, some conflicting views on how much of that should be done from different perspectives. So currently, I guess the question is, how do we manage ports, and how do we see things going forward if this bill is passed?
A short response, unfortunately, please.
We see ports as kind of key hubs in respect of the intermodal connectivity of our transportation system and global supply chain. And as a result, they are integral in respect of the data that they are in a position to collect regarding traffic coming in and out, but also from vessels, but also from other elements of the supply chain and other elements of the transportation system.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off there, but we can continue hopefully in the next round of questioning. Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Next up, we have Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses. Welcome. Earlier, Mr. Bijimin, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You said something in your opening remarks. You said that the department was concerned with regard to security, but also with regard to how fluid the supply chain was, how efficient it was. You also spoke about how the minister would be given powers to intervene at that level. I would like to know, did the department or maybe did Justice conduct a study to determine whether these provisions and the additional powers of the minister, whether these things could have an impact on workers' right to strike or free association? No. The bill does not affect collective agreements. There's nothing to do with the unions or the right to bargain. The powers given to the minister are for issues such as a pandemic. When the pandemic occurred, the minister could give an interim order to ask a ship to mandate N95 masks aboard. So the minister would have that power, but it has nothing to do with labor or unions. Do you have a legal opinion? Was a legal opinion produced? I looked at the documents that were sent, and I believe I found a charter analysis of the bill and a charter statement, but this wasn't mentioned here. So I'm asking myself why it wasn't mentioned. If we find it, we'll give it to you. Okay. Another question for you with regard to infrastructure. There is a provision for blocking infrastructure. It specifically mentions blocking railroads, but it also mentions ports, I believe. There's one provision that prohibits blocking or imperiling the security or safety of such infrastructure. I would like to know, what does this provision do concretely? Why did you feel the need to add it to the act, to the bill, rather? At the end of the day, there were times where we saw blockages, and there was an impact on the supply chain. These blockades were a problem for supply chains and security. Law enforcement was involved and working with authorities to ensure that railroads be safe and secure and efficient as well. We saw examples of behaviors and acts that were dangerous and concerning. Are you referring to the blockade done by Indigenous protesters in 2020 and 2021? Indeed, that is an example of a blockade. But there were other examples. There are examples of people intentionally blocking railroads and other infrastructure. This is dangerous for railroad operators as well as it is for others. Sometimes it happens, sometimes passenger trains are blocked. I understand that you want to deter anyone from blocking railroads. I'm still wondering whether this provision is necessary. There are already injunction mechanisms in force, and that is why I asked you this question. Maybe if you have any strong points to convince me. I'm running out of time here, so I just wanted to also talk about the issue of appointing the chairman of the board of directors of port authorities. What led you to change the way the chairs were appointed? Do you think that there are gaps to fill in that regard? With regard to the chair appointment, port authorities are responsible for managing the day-to-day operations. They are also in charge of having a strategic planning. The minister's responsibility is to provide a strategic vision for ports. What we came up with was the following. If the minister is responsible for the strategic part and the Port Authority is supported by the chair for the strategic portion, if the minister had the opportunity to appoint a chair, it would give the minister a little bit more influence to ensure that the strategic plan's purpose is implemented in a way that is in a way that meets expectations. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Yours, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today to answer our questions and help us understand in greater detail this bill before us. I wanted to start with the work of this committee. As you're aware, this committee conducted a study early last year on the topic of railway safety in Canada, something that's of urgent concern to a lot of communities, particularly on the 10th anniversary of the disaster in Lac-Mégantic. And the report that we issued, I believe it was last May, included 33 recommendations. Some of them reflected things that communities and concerned citizens have been calling for a long, long time. And yet, this legislation in front of us reflects none of those recommendations. And I'm wondering why that is.
Thank you for the question, Chair. So yes, I do want to acknowledge that the May 2022 Railway Safety Report by this committee, from our perspective, was a very helpful report. That report, along with reports from the Transportation Safety Board, the Office of the Auditor General, have fed into our continuous cycle of policy and regulatory modernization. The legislative powers we currently have under the Railway Safety Act are quite broad and give us quite a lot of powers already. So most of the recommendations in that report we are moving forward with. There's about 30 of them that have either been completed or we have actions underway to complete, and we're able to do that within existing legislative authorities.
My next question stems from the first one. One of the big concerns is around the reliance on safety management systems as the primary tool for ensuring the safety of our railroads. Now, I think most Canadians who are concerned about railway safety would be surprised that the primary regulatory system for ensuring safety is a proprietary document that they're not allowed to read. So there's very little transparency in terms of how these giant rail corporations are creating a culture and a system of safety in their operations. Now, this legislation before us envisions security management systems, and I think most people would understand why having a company's security system transparent and public might not be the best idea. But safety management systems seem like something that the public should have some line of sight on. Has the department considered making safety management systems public, as has been requested by advocates, communities, and citizens concerned about rail safety?
So with regard to the legislative framework, so our framework, we have the umbrella legislation of the Railway Safety Act. Beneath that, Mr. Chair, we have 35 different regulations and rules. And beneath that, 25 engineering standards and guidelines, which in the aggregate provide a fairly complex layer of authorities and a regulatory framework that guides safety in the rail industry. Safety management systems is one of those regulations, and as the member noted, it's an important part of that overall layer of rules and requirements. I will concede that we need to do a better job at effectiveness in safety management systems, and that's something that this committee has told us to do. That's something that the Transportation Safety Board has told us to do, and something that the Office of the Auditor General has told us to do. So we're doing it.
Mr. Scott, I don't think you answered the primary question, which is why aren't they public?
So as part of our regulatory refresh and as part of that work, we began effectiveness audits in April of last year. The next step is to refresh the regulation because to your point, it's a little dated. It's from 2015. A part of that work, we want to lock in some of that effectiveness approach that we've now started to do. And part of that, we'll be looking at what other changes we need to make, including around the issues that you're raising around transparency.
The next question, the changes to the Marine Act, Section 1071, includes the language, and I believe my colleague has already cited this. If the minister is of the opinion that there is a risk of imminent harm to national security, national economic security, or competition that constitutes a significant threat to the safety and security of persons, goods, ships, or port facilities, or the security of supply chains, very broad wording, the minister may, by order, require a port authority or a person in charge of a port facility to take any measure, including corrective measures, to stop any activity, etc. And in your earlier comments, you clarified that this was not intended to cover labor disruptions or labor action. Did the department consider specific wording that would exclude those cases from the scope of this legislation?
So it will not. And we could definitely take it back and see if we could provide further clarification to make sure labor action is excluded. But I could tell you it's not the spirit, it's not the intent, but we could definitely clarify it.
One of the concerns, I know I have 30 seconds, I'll try to fit in one more question. One of the concerns we've heard from port authorities is the slowness of Transport Canada and the minister in appointing board members to the boards of port authorities. I think the record among transport boards is one of the slowest across all of government. It seems like this act makes that puts more of the responsibility for that process in the hands of the minister. How is the department going to address the issue of timelines when it comes to appointing board directors?
15-second response, please.
Sure. It is a multi-pronged approach. So there's the minister, there's PCO, there's PMO, there's a whole bunch of actors. And I could tell you we've gotten together and we are all on board in lowering the, I believe, 50%, whatever that number was, to something much more manageable. So we're all in and do agree in getting these positions nominated as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Muse, opening up our second round of questioning. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. So let me pick up on the discussion of supply chains. I mean, we all know the importance of the fluidity of supply chains to our economy. We saw that in particular during the pandemic and following the pandemic. And, you know, that impacts, has an impact on prices to consumers, lost opportunities for our economy, lost opportunities for our farmers. And so I know my friend and colleague mentioned 21 recommendations of the National Supply Chain Task Force. By the way, 13 of those were immediate, and that was 21 months ago. And so I know that you've indicated that some of those are included within Bill C-33. So maybe you could explain exactly how, you know, new advisory panels, new regulations, new powers to the minister, actually benefit supply chains and not just Ottawa bureaucrats?
Sure thing. So I'll say a few things on the bill that benefits the supply chain, and I'll talk about the advisory committee. So on Bill C-33, one of the key element of the bill is around data. And there's two parts to it. One part is data for operational efficiency. So for the first time, ports will now have access to data for operational efficiency. And then the second part is data for visibility. So having that data will then allow the ports to better plan, manage traffic, and ensure the fluidity of the port operations. So that's a very crucial part of it, combined with other measures that we're hoping passes through this bill to give those ports additional access to and power to help traffic beyond their current waters. So I would say those are really key things that will be helpful. On the advisory committees, we also think at the same time that ports are focused on supply chain efficiency and fluidity, that the input of the community should be taken into account. And the current bill is proposing that the three committees be established, a local community, a stakeholder community, and an Indigenous community. And we really think having those three committees at the table, along with a focus on supply chain efficiency, fluidity, is just the right approach to take, because the port has numerous stakeholders, numerous shareholders, and with small s shareholders, and making sure that all those folks are on board as these activities start taking place will be the right way to ensure it's done successfully.
I'm glad you mentioned data and reporting requirements, because that burden disproportionately impacts smaller ports versus larger ports to go through all those processes and report that back to Transport Canada and the other requirements. Has there been any analysis done of the costs to ports of these new requirements and how they would differ?
Yeah. So those are regulatory making power. And during the regulatory phase, there will be a RIA, so regulatory impact. No, it's done through the regulatory impact assessment stage.
We're going to look at a piece of legislation that imposes requirements for which no cost analysis has been done.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
So no cost analysis has been done as to how much this is going to cost a port of, whether it's a small or a large port.
No, we haven't done an independent cost analysis of the financial reporting requirements for ports. Was that your question?
Well, of any of these new requirements, right? Have you so has any analysis been done, whether it's reporting requirements, whether it's the advisory, are we sort of just flying blind here and trust that this isn't going to impact small ports adversely?
So in the context of the proposed changes, we understand that, and we are working through right now how we can ensure that we aren't unduly burdening smaller ports in terms of their ability to respond to those new requirements, and that includes the consideration of whether or not there should be modifications to some of the requirements under the legislation.
Yeah, and just to pick up on what she's saying, so there could be openness to looking at how many committees these small ports may end up having to do, or the number of members. But what I will say as well is that a lot of those amendments are meant to really address the issue of transparency across all CPAs, and just ushering this new era of transparency and openness as well.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us today. And I was interested in the comment in introducing this bill C33. You talked about that the core of this is efficient, safe, secure, and resilient supply chains and transportation, but also mentioned the port contribution to climate objectives. So I would love to hear in what form that would take, and also if there's been any discussion, if there's any preparation to advance the transition from fossil fuel power for ships that are anchored to clean power through the provision of clean power at the port, and also any work, any discussion internationally or through Transport Canada or in this bill that could lead to a greater use of cleaner energy as opposed to bunker C fuel in the vessels that come into the port and use its facilities.
Sure. So in terms of the legislation itself, there are new requirements regarding the development of 5-year plans regarding climate change actions, so GHG mitigation measures effectively that ports will be working through. So that can include a range of activities, and there's provisions in the legislation regarding what those plans, some of what those plans will include, as well as provisions regarding the development of regulations regarding GHG emissions targets or reductions targets for ports. And on the flip side of that, there's also the climate adaptation strategy. So there's also reporting requirements for the ports to develop 5-year plans regarding adaptation, so how they're going to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And in both instances, there's also requirements for yearly reporting on those 5-year plans to explain, for ports to explain how they are how they are progressing against their 5-year plans. And so that, from the port's perspective, from the legislative perspective, are really kind of the key aspects from an internal port perspective. But complementary to that, there are a number of initiatives that are underway, and I'll...
Yeah, sure, and I'll touch on one in particular. So in Budget 23, I believe, Budget 2023, 165 million was set aside for a green shipping program, a green shipping corridor program, and that's meant to essentially begin the hard work of decarbonizing ports, bringing in new clean energy sources, hydrogen hubs, etc. So that program is currently being designed, and the hope is that they will be able to launch before the end of the calendar year. So that's an additional thing that's being done.
Thank you. And opening remarks also mentioned improving communication with port communities and local residents. And I know that a number of years ago, that was certainly something that in the Port of Vancouver, we were looking to have an improved connection between the port and the community. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for the port to be a tourist hub and be more connected with the commerce of downtown Vancouver itself. So could you talk about how the bill will facilitate that there be greater collaboration and coordination between the city, its businesses and residents, and the Port Authority and the port operations?
So there's a number of measures kind of contained in the legislation that would help support that. The first, which we've already talked about, are the advisory committees, which provide a more formalized mechanism for communities to have input into the port operations. And this is, in recognition that our CPAs don't exist in a vacuum. They don't conduct their operations in a vacuum. They are situated within, in most instances, within within municipalities and communities, and the relationship with those communities are really important in respect of the effective operation of the port. So the advisory committees in particular are an important mechanism to ensure that that communication is ongoing. Another piece of the legislation which supports that are the updating and the publication of the land use plans on a more regular basis. So this provides a vehicle for the port to explain to the community where it's headed and where it's going.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reid. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you off once again, and thank you, Ms. Murray. Prochainement, nous avons M. Barcelouval. À vous la parole. 2 minutes.
Next up, Mr. Barcelouval, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I wanted to read 3 articles. I'll try to go quickly. First of all, 6.11, the section 6.11, the minister can make certain things to ensure an immediate action to prevent a threat that is direct or indirect with regard to maritime transportation, security, or safety. That's section 6.11. Then there's 17.11. The minister can, if he deems that there is an immediate danger for maritime transport, can ensure for the security of people, infrastructure, and vessels and others, and for the security of people involved in the process, can force any person or infrastructure to do anything that he deems acceptable to face this danger. Then section 107.1. Now we're talking about an estimation here. If there is a risk of a danger, so a risk of imminent danger that is imminent to national security, to the country's economic security, or to competition, and if this is an important threat to goods, to safety, or to the supply chain as a whole, the minister can order the port administration and or authority to take any measures, including any corrective measures that would put an end to this threat. What I try to get and understand from this is that the minister has broad powers. He doesn't need anything. He just needs to be able to deem that a danger exists in order to order all kinds of things. I would like to know what is the extent of the minister's powers, because it seems like there's nothing he can't do with this. What led us to draft these provisions was the COVID pandemic. During the COVID pandemic, we were not able to work with vessels and operators in order to mitigate certain health risks and situations, especially in especially during COVID. We also noticed that the overall environment is changing. There are additional risks. There are additional dangers. We are giving the minister is being given additional powers. But as the bill states, these are for situations. Unfortunately, Mr. Barcelouval, I would just like to know what the minister can't do. Thank you, Mr. Barcelouval, and the witness.
Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleague, Mr. Strahl, talked a little bit about anchorages, and he presented what I think could be characterized as the view of the port authorities, which is that they need more room to park vessels when there's congestion. I'd like to present a contrary view, which is that of communities, particularly communities in the southern Gulf Islands that have seen incredibly ecologically sensitive areas very close to their communities turned into industrial parking lots. I know this is a concern that you're familiar with. Does Bill C-33 include provisions that allow the minister to intervene on behalf of communities and prevent those areas from being used as industrial parking lots by shipping companies?
The legislation includes a clarification of the mandate of ports in respect of the traffic management for vessels entering into the port waters. There's concurrently with that work that's underway, which some of you may be familiar with the VFPA, in terms of how traffic is better managed throughout the southern Gulf Islands to ensure that we are mitigating the community concerns around the use of those anchorages for a number of reasons. One of the key things that vessel traffic management will enable is is the actual mitigation of those types of issues that you've raised, including where ships are anchored, how long they're anchored, and then the activities that they're conducting while they're at anchorage to ensure that they are that they are respecting kind of both the environment and the community concerns in the surrounding areas. So it's a combination of the legislation plus the activities that would be undertaken by the ports as they have those authorities to be able to direct that traffic.
So currently the use of those anchorages is entirely at the discretion of the Port Authority. Does this bill change that in any way?
So currently, the anchorages are effectively a common law right for safe navigation. And so there are a number of protocols and regulations across government which impact like how vessels can conduct their operations at those anchorages. So the Port Authority, in terms of that, they have an interim protocol that's in place that are working with the vessels to ensure that they are moving along in terms of improving how they're operating and the use of the anchorages in the Southern Gulf Islands.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reid, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Muse once again. The floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Sure. And my colleague, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, wanted to know what the minister can't do. I don't think he got quite the answer to the question that he wanted, or certainly not elaborate. But one of the things we do know the minister can do is appoint the chair, and I know that question has been asked a couple times, and the point has been made that already there's a tardiness in making appointments to the Port Authority boards. But if the Port Authorities are to be arm's length from the government, which is the intention, it seems a step backwards that the government is appointing the chair. And so, why is this bill reducing ports' independence in that sense and sort of imposing an Ottawa knows best approach?
So the minister, so just to walk a little bit through the actual process on how that would take place. The minister would appoint the chair from the group of directors of the port. So he would not parachute a chair from somewhere else. It would be someone who's a director within that port. And it would be done in consultation with the board members. So it's not a stranger being parachuted. It's someone that's already part of that board of director. And the minister, in consultation with that board of director, will pick the chair. So that's the way that the legislation has been written. That's the way that we currently intend on proposing that it be brought forward.
Switching gears, maybe you can elaborate a bit on how Bill C-33 promotes private sector investment and involvement in the transportation sector, particularly in response to the Port Modernizations Review, which one of the objectives in there was unleashing the potential of the private sector.
So a couple things on how it promotes private sector review, private sector investment. I think in the first instance, what we're trying to do with Bill C-33 is promote the right type of private sector investment. So there is a proposal in there to reduce the current threshold for review from 93 million to 10 million. And I would just note, reducing that threshold does not impact our trade agreement with the EU or the UK. So what we're trying to do is put in place a system that allows more of these projects to be scrutinized to make sure that they meet our national security, national economic security objectives, and just given the fact that ports are strategic enablers of the Canadian economy. So that's the rationale behind that.
I got 2 minutes. Oh my gosh, time is flying. So with this change in threshold and recognizing our the strategic value of ports and the constraints that we would have with international agreements, do you feel then that this will help create some efficiencies in supply chains that will, we're not going to see a repeat of what we've seen coming out of the pandemic where there was some bottlenecks?
I think what it will do, combined with the investment framework and also combined with the triennial review for the borrowing limit, I do think it should lead to more timely decision when it comes to investing in ports. That's what we think.
I know that the question was already asked about, the very slim provisions for rail safety in the bill, and of course, one of those was with regard to rail blockades, which you talked about. But from what I understand, there was already those provisions. If there's rail blockade, there's tools available to address that. So what's new that actually addresses that problem?
Yeah, so it's the provisions that were there before were, and I'm not a lawyer, but the language, I guess, matters, and the language was more around trespassing, and this just makes the legislation clearer around, acts that are like vandalism, which we do see some of that. Compromising security. So
that didn't exist under
not in that way.
So law enforcement couldn't act on those things.
Right.
I mean, obviously, you're going
Thank
to
you very
potentially
much.
jeopardize people's health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. And finally, for this round of questioning, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a pretty robust bill, very robust. When we look at it and we read it and we read the whole bill, you look at the changes and the contemplations with the Canada Marine Act, modernization, the alignment with the supply chain study, and hopefully soon to be strategy, the multimodal networks and the alignment of the different methods of transportation, railroad, air, and water, capital investments, the expectation that assets will be more disciplined, more managed in a disciplined manner. Versus the past with a lot of ports and in my area, including the St. Lawrence Seaway. Port competitiveness, managing traffic, developing possible inland waterways, and really expanding in those, the strategic planning of different ports, implementing their strategic plans, once again, and aligning themselves with the different aspects of the business. When we look at governance and working with indigenous groups and environmental sustainability and railway safety and security and transparency, adaptability, and the list goes on. Once again, a very robust bill. And with that, what I like about it is it really takes on a whole of government approach and really concentrates on something government has to do more of, and that's concentrating on the business of government versus concentrating on the business of, well, I have one word for it, but I'll be polite, the business of politics. And so I like that. And with that said as well, the expectation from this study will be that once it goes back to the House for third reading, that it'll take into consideration a lot of the testimony that's coming out of this. Because although it's a very robust bill, there's still a bit of work that has to be done to it, and I'm hoping a lot of that work will come out of both committee as well as when it goes back to the House for third reading. So 2 questions, because this is definitely going to add a lot of capacity, a lot of opportunities for economy. I know in my area, Niagara, this is what we depend on. This alone is what's rebuilding our economy. And with that said, the challenge, however, is recognizing the capacity that we need to fulfill what this bill is trying to do. So my first question is to Mr. Hamilton with respect to CBSA. And the capacities with CBSA, there's no question that it's going to place a burden. I won't say a burden, but a pressure, I'll use that word, on your organization to really pick up in areas that you may not be existing now. Container ports in different parts of the country that don't exist right now. In the Great Lakes, we have the cruise ship industry that didn't exist before. So my first question through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Hamilton is, are you going to have that capacity to fulfill those obligations to be able to meet the increases within that sector?
Perfect. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. I would just like to say that CBSA has undertaken a variety of modernization efforts across both our traveler stream as well as our commercial stream, really to drive home some increased efficiencies so we can look at redeploying some of those frontline border services officers that are currently working on transactional sort of low value processing of either travelers or working with commercial importers to be able to redirect them to either growth areas where we're seeing increased traffic coming in, either, again, commercial traffic or traveler traffic, but then also be able to, importantly, I think, have them work more on sort of intelligence-driven reviews of containerized traffic coming in. So our targeting efforts are going up, and we think with some of the data that we're going to be able to receive, not only this being provided through this bill, but also new data systems that we're investing in at CBSA, we'll be able to increase the efficiency of our targeting processing as well, and to make sure that we're protecting the supply chain by making sure that goods that are prohibited from entry to Canada are being caught and stopped at the border.
This bill will be an enabler for you.
Yes, in short order, yes, absolutely, this bill will be an enabler for us. The provisions specifically in the Customs Act that are referenced in the bill will provide the ability for CBSA to prescribe the amount of time a shipper is provided to be able to transfer us a container for examination. Right now, there is no sort of set service standard for that process to happen. Sometimes it can take up to 16 days for CBSA officers to identify to a port operator that we'd like to see container X, and it would be upwards of 3 weeks before that container will be provided to us. That provides a lot of time for nefarious actors in the ports to be able to remove contraband before we're able to examine it, and so being able to regulate the time that it takes for those containers to be delivered to us for examination will in fact be a great enabler to us and will strengthen port security in our opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. To TC staff, with respect to capacity with infrastructure, how do you see this bill being once again an enabler to really bring up and bring up to date our different methods of transportation and the infrastructure that's attached to it, specifically marine and rail?
30-second response, please.
Good luck.
So I think it will set the groundwork to allow certain ports to increase their borrowing limits in a much more easier way. I think that's one. And then combined with that, the NTCF, National Trade Corridor Fund, has provided quite a lot of funding to port a project, I believe 745 million to around 45 different sorts of projects, and I fully expect if there is another recapitalization, that combined with a more streamlined approach to borrowing limit could help unlock capital, enhance exactly. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Have access to the CIB as well.
Great job, guys.
Thank you both. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our witnesses from the CBSA and Transport Canada for being with us and for sharing their testimony. With that, I will suspend, for 2 minutes, although I'm sure my colleagues would like me to adjourn. We will suspend for 2 minutes to change over the witnesses. We'll see you in 2 minutes, folks. Appearing before us for the second half of today's meeting, we have from Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 279, Mr. Clint Crabtree, President and Business Agent. Welcome. From International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada, we have Mr. Robert Ashton, President. Welcome. Et de Syndicat des débardeurs, section locale 375 du Syndicat canadien de la fonction publique, we have Mr. Michel Murray, Union Advisor, Canadian Union of Public Employees. We will begin with you, Mr. Ashton, for your opening remarks, and you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you again. My name is Rob Ashton. I'm the National President for the International Longshore Warehouse Union Canada, representing approximately 8,000 longshore workers that work in the ports in Canada's Pacific Coast, including Vancouver, Fraser, Prince Rupert, Nanaimo, and Port Alberni Port Authorities. Bill C-33, which purports to be legislation to mean marine security, favors the economic interests of corporations and businesses over the rights of workers that are essential to the productivity of the ports. In order to maintain a balance between the interests of employers and business and workers, ILW Canada urges Parliament to promote labour stability by ensuring that a representative labour is included on the board of directors for each port authority, and amending the Canada Marine Act to recognize the rights of workers. The composition of the board of directors. Bill C-33 proposes to increase the maximum number of directors of a port authority from 11 to 13, increase the number of directors nominated by municipalities from 1 to 2, and increase the number of directors to be appointed by provinces set out in the letters patent of the port to 2. ILW Canada encourages the government that Bill C-33 should include an amendment in Section 14 of the Canada Marine Act, which would include a representative labour in the ports. Port Authority Board of Directors favor business. For example, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority Board is heavily represented by directors with business interests. Catherine McClay, former CFO of Translink, former senior executive of Canfor and Howe Sound Pulp and Paper. James Belsheim, current chair of the Coal Exporting Terminal Operators Association, former president of Neptune Terminals in Metro Vancouver, and former director of the BCMEA. Bruce Chan, director of the BC Ferries and Kintrax Energy, formerly almost 20 years in senior positions with TK Corporation, one of the world's largest marine energy transportation, storage, and production companies. Craig Monroe, labor lawyer, representing employer interests. His law firm represents port users, including coal terminals, West Shore Terminals in Vancouver, and Trigon Terminals in Prince Rupert. Mike Corrigan, CEO of Interferry Incorporated, a global trade association representing ferry employers, former CEO of BC Ferries, and a former senior manager at West Coast Energy. Creating a requirement that a Port Authority's board of directors include a representative of the labor ensures a voice for labor, which will minimize the potential future disputes, such as the expansion of Robert Banks in the Port of Vancouver. Port authorities on the west coast of the United States have representative port workers on their boards and directors, and they function quite well. At the Port of San Francisco, the 5-person Board of Commissioners includes Willie Adams, the international president of the ILWU, and Gail Gilman, CEO and activist for the homelessness and social enterprise. At the Port of Los Angeles, the 5-person Board of Commissioners includes Diane Middleton, a labor lawyer and worker advocate, and Michael Munoz, an organizer for the Teamsters and activist with the Warehouse Worker Resource Center. So the next point I want to talk about is the recognition of rights of workers. The ILW Canada is concerned, as evidenced by the recent collective bargaining experience on the West Coast, that the economic interests of the ports are eclipsing the fundamental rights of workers to engage in free collective bargaining. Our concern is magnified by the proposal in Bill C-33 to add the resilience in supply chains as a purpose of the Canada Marine Act. Supply chains are important to trade, but the economic interests in supply chains cannot be permitted to override free collective bargaining, which the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized as a fundamental freedom protected by Section 2D of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If Bill C-33 is amended to recognize the role of supply chains as a purpose of the Canada Marine Act, the ILW Canada submits that the CMA should also include as its purpose recognize free collective bargaining. The Canada Labour Code sets out in this goal in the preamble to Part 1. Whereas there is a long tradition in Canada of labour legislation and policy designed for the promotion of the common well-being through the encouragement of free collective bargaining and the constructive settlement of disputes. Including the same language in the Canada Marine Act sends a message that Parliament does not intend business interests to outweigh fundamental rights. In conclusion, labor organizations are stakeholders in port security and amending Bill C-33 to ensure that ports are governed with worker interests as a consideration is necessary for Parliament to maintain consistency with international obligations such as the ILO and IMO Port Security Code, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and security legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashton. You were perfectly on time, and we always appreciate that here at Transport Committee. Prochainement, next, we have Mr. Murray. Mr. Murray, à vous la parole. You have 5 minutes. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee members for having us today. I completely echo the words that my colleague Mr. Ashton said. I represent the Syndicat des débardeurs of the Port of Montreal. That represents 1,400 men and women who work as longshore workers in the Port of Montreal. Our concerns were already arose earlier. Our greatest concerns were with regard to the Marine Transportation Security Act and certain clauses of the bill that would grant the minister additional powers. I'm here referring to Clause 611 of page 38 of the bill, that is the emergency provisions and orders. These are new powers that the minister has, and Section 17.1 that are new emergency injunctions. Our main concern was the following. Do these new powers or new injunctions or new orders, do they violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 2, the right of association, and, as my colleague Robert said, the right to strike, which is an essential right that workers have. Workers, every 1, 2, or 4, 5 years, can negotiate freely with their employers. This was one of our concerns. Mr. Ridgeman, I hope that I am saying his name correctly. He said that it will not affect the right to strike and the power of negotiations that unions have, following a question by Mr. Barcelo-Duval. I humbly submit that these powers that the minister is giving himself in the new bill speak of issues. We heard about this would be a COVID, that COVID would be a good justification, but the new bill does not mention COVID in its description of the new powers. So I would humbly submit to the committee the following. These new powers, if these powers do not violate the Canada Labour Code and the Charter and the rights of both unions and workers in the Canada Labour Code, and do not violate international treaties that Canada signed, the international BIT treaties as signed in 1948. Canada signed it in 1972. There is a committee that examines the enforcement of that treaty. It says that ports are not essential services. If the bill violates our right to strike, it surely should not violate the Canada Labour Code and the international treaties and other documents that were signed by Canada in the past. Lastly, with regard to the minister's appointment of a chairman of the Port Authority Board, I would like to voice one concern. At the Port of Montreal, the Montreal Port Authority is our boss, and the Association of Port Authorities, they work hand in hand. When the Association of Port Authorities does certain things, we need to ensure that we have the right to strike. The Port Authority works hand in hand with the authorities. They are in cahoots. They have the same legal firms in order to fight us, in order to remove rights from us. So when I see in the bill that the minister can appoint the chairman of the board or a chairperson, I am concerned with that. This is because I believe these are quote unquote political appointments that would meddle in our work labor relations, because this is the situation. I am voicing my concerns with regard to this that could happen. Thank you for listening. I am here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Mr. Murray. Unfortunately, colleagues, Mr. Crabtree is not with us.
Testimony today. So with that in mind, we will move immediately with our first line of questioning, and that 6 minutes slot, goes to Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. 6 minutes, sir.
I think we better go to Dan Muse.
Okay. Mr. Muse, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 6 minutes.
My gosh. Like 3 in a row. What's with that? Okay. So you talked about the fact that the chair, of course, is a political appointment, and now the minister is going to make that appointment. So what would you suggest is a better way to do that? Is it going? Are you ready for the translation? Okay. You talked about the fact that
inaudible
now appointed by the minister is a political appointment. Yes. So what would you suggest is a better way to, appoint the chair? Is that the existing way? Is there a different model that you'd suggest?
I would just like to say the following with regard to port authorities. I do not want to suggest one way of doing things over another. All I'm saying is that this political appointment can have consequences on us as unions. As soon as someone is appointed by the minister, they are accountable in a way to the minister with regard to the actions they do in the labor relations activities they do. I'll give you an example. I don't think the minister, there was a CEO of the Port of Montreal. He was amazing. He went all over the world to draw in new clientele. This man was not appointed by the minister and yet was doing amazing work. I do not believe that the chair as a political appointment will improve labor relations. I think it will make them worse, and that is my humble opinion.
It's not just labor relations, but perhaps the overall effectiveness of the role of the chair. That if this person is a political appointment, in that sense, they may have a divided interest, so to speak, rather than looking out for the interests of what is best for the port overall.
Indeed. I agree with you. I just wanted to go back to what I was talking about earlier, and I'll make a link with the powers that the minister has. We are asking ourselves, are these well regulated? Are they well regulated? It's not written in the bill. Imagine if nobody had asked questions about this, if the bill hadn't specified this. There is an appointment here by the minister of the chair. The minister can not only name the chair, but can delegate certain roles within the port authorities. So for us, it's a real concern with regard to labor relations.
So overall in your testimony, you've pointed out a number of deficiencies in Bill C-33. So would you agree that Bill C-33 is a fundamentally flawed piece of legislation? Maybe you both can comment on that.
S'il est fondamentalement quoi?
Flawed.
No,
I wouldn't say that it's fundamentally flawed. I just wanted to talk about the concerns we have with regard to labor relations. We have certain charter rights to association, and we have certain rights to put pressure, as a Supreme Court decision said. Are there other things in the bill that will help buttress our supply chains and railway networks? Of course, I would imagine so. What we're doing here is to talk to you about our concerns with regard to labor relations. I'm not the best person to tell you that this is a bad bill or a good bill. I'm just here to share our concerns.
I won't opine as to which parts are good and which parts are bad. Anything to add, Mr. Ashton?
I echo my colleagues' comments on that. We look at the port authorities in BC. I won't put words in my friend's mouth. You got to look at the board of directors, right? Without any type of labor organizations or community organizations represented on the port authority boards, then how do you have community buy-in? How do you have labor buy-in on new projects? RBT2 could have been done completely different, but it's a terminal that's not needed. It's a terminal that's going to cause more supply chain issues than fix them, and yet the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is still pushing it, and so is the Canadian government.
So looking at, just to expand on that point, so not just the Port of Vancouver, but other ports across the country, the current composition of the boards, would you say, are there any good examples? And if not, where are the deficiencies?
I can only speak to ports in BC, and I see no community interest on these Port Authority boards. I see no labor. I see big business, and they're all political appointees. And the other aspect is when I've seen some of the MPs here on this panel asking questions about where does the minister's abilities end. They weren't given an answer.
Right.
And so the ability, my fear, and I believe my brother's fear here, is that the minister could have the ability to say, you're not allowed to go on strike. You're not allowed to use your fundamental charter rights to defend your workers and defend what their needs and wants are on their day-to-day lives. And that scares the hell out of me.
So Bill C-33 has too much, gives the minister too much say.
Could be a bit open-ended.
Mr. Muse. Thank you, Mr. Ashton. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Murray. Prochainement, next, we have Murray. Ms. Murray, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for being here to provide your thoughts and reflections. The first one I wanted to ask about, the first issue, has to do with the changes that the bill makes to prohibit unruly interference with railway work, including unruly behavior towards railway employees. And I am still, it's still imprinted in my memory, the issues when a pipeline crossing was without permission by the hereditary chiefs of the nation across whose claimed territory this was being built. It ended up with railway blockages that shut down rail traffic in quite a bit of the country. And I think there was even fires being built on railway, on the rails themselves. So what kind of impact does that have on your members when these seemingly unassociated conflicts are affecting railway work? And do you see the changes that the bill is making to prohibit that being adequate to protect your members?
At the Port of Montreal, I remember the events that you're talking about, Ms. Murray. The impact was rather minimal in Montreal. I didn't see any trains that weren't able to enter the port. I'm speaking from memory here, of course. These are effects on the Port of Montreal, on the railroad of the Port of Montreal. They were quite minimal indeed.
So I do have an opinion. There's a fine balance that we have to draw on this. Protecting the workers that are in place, protecting their health and safety, their ability to do their job is, of course, of the utmost importance. 100%. I have that feeling for all workers in this country. But the other thing that we have to understand when we're looking at this type of language is it's every Canadian's, my humble opinion, right to protest a company, our government, what they see fit, as long as that protest falls within the laws of the land. But if you restrict the individual's right to protest, you are restricting the right of Canadians to air their opinions. Now, if it puts workers into an unsafe position, then that has to be rectified for sure. But to be able to say that because of what the Wet'suwet'en protesters did, doing what they thought was right to protect what is their land, and if they do not put workers' lives or in jeopardy, then who is the Canadian government to say they cannot do it? Who's the government to say that an individual cannot have the ability to protest something that is wrong? And that's what this bill does, is it says, you don't have a right to have your say anymore, we're going to take it from you as a Canadian. But we all have to understand that the livelihoods of these workers are put in place. That's of the utmost importance.
So it's a balance that has to be struck, and I was trying to get a sense for your view on that balance, but because time is tight, I will go to another question. And this has to do with the transportation of dangerous goods regime. In Metro Vancouver, in places like Surrey and White Rock, for example, there I know has been concern in the past with the transportation of dangerous goods, and this Bill C-33 makes changes to the regime with the establishment of penalties and I think other changes. So from your perspective, are these changes ones that you and your members support? And are there other things that you thought should be done?
So if you're talking about the transportation of dangerous goods via rail, I wouldn't have an answer for you. An educated answer for you.
Je crois que en parallèle, nous non plus.
As neither, we do not represent railroad workers, but I do believe that you will have a representative of those railroad workers come by the end of October to your committee.
I am surprised to hear that because so you're representing port workers, and this transportation typically is to or from ports. To other destinations, and so I guess what I'm hearing is that the changes in these
different union in longshore and railroad. Then you're going to have another union is going to appeal here in front of this committee who represent the railroad workers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Murray. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Vous la parole.
Next up, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Welcome. Good afternoon to our witnesses. Good evening now. I would like to get into the topic and to talk about something that you are here for, and this is the issue of the workers' right to strike and freedom of association. The officials from Transport Canada made me feel like they had this idea that they wanted to reassure us with regard to the impact of the bill on workers' rights. When we read the clauses in the bill, we see that the minister gets a lot of power. And then the question needs to be asked, how is this going to be implemented in reality? There's often all kinds of situations that are brought up, like emergencies and et cetera, that would make it so the minister's powers would be appropriate. You spoke of a possibility of writing in the bill that, notwithstanding the content of the bill, that workers' right to protest or freedom of association should not be hindered in the bill. Would that be something that would decrease your fears in that regard? The sponsor of the bills, or the people who talked about it, brought it forward. We need to look at the charter. It's Section 2D of the charter. Section 2D must not be superseded by the new powers of the minister. There's also the Canada Labour Code. The Canada Labour Code has certain provisions with regard to freedoms of strike and association. There are other treaties that were signed by Canada that allows unions to exert economic pressure. The International Community Treaty was signed by Canada, and in that treaty, ports were not considered an essential service. There is one organization that looks at essential services. It's not transport. It's not anything else. It's the Canada Industrial Board. They determine what are major threats for Canada. It's an administrative tribunal, actually, and it specializes in that regard. What you're talking about could reassure us, but it corroborates something else. It's the second time that I'm before a parliamentary committee talking about a bill. The first time was in 1995, was an amendment to the Canada Labour Code, so that kind of reveals my age here, that it was Mr. Balfonso Aliardo. He was a friend of our union. This is the second time that I'm doing this. This was SIM, the Standing Committee on Trade, and in 1995, there were testimony given about the intentions of Parliament. We need to ask ourselves what the intention of Parliament here, if the bill says that it will not affect workers' rights, then we won't have to do that. Thank you. That answers my question. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? You have 3 minutes, Mr. Basaluzaval. Perfect. My next question for you is the following. It is with regard to how a chair of a port authority should be appointed. The bill shows that the government wants to take control of this process, that the government wants to appoint chairmen of port authorities across Canada. I think that the issue of politicization was raised here. This position is being politicized. When somebody appoints another person, that second person becomes accountable to the person who named them, who appointed them. So ultimately, the chair would be accountable to the minister. What is the moral authority of this individual? There's a system that works in these organizations. Moral authority is very important. It helps to ensure the integrity of the system. It exists so that people cannot be the spokesperson for the government. Am I wrong here? I've known times where the boards elected and appointed their own chair. This was the case for many years at the Port of Montreal. It showed that the Port of Montreal was well served by people who wanted it to remain competitive. The chairs invited union representatives to the process and invited us to meetings with international clients where we would go get clients. But political appointments, in all evidence, comes to add difficulty to relations that can already be difficult in the marine transportation sector. What's important to remember is that we don't negotiate with companies. We negotiate with union associations that are appointed by these companies. So we already have problems with these people, but if there's already appointments by port authorities who are not our members, there can be additional interference. And these kind of political appointments concern us a lot. Thank you, Mr. Basaluzaval.
Back rack, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for appearing today. I'd like to start my questions fairly generally, and my sense in the conversations that have led to this legislation, my sense is that there's a tension that exists when it comes to Canada's ports and our port authorities. Speaking with port authorities, they wish to act more independently and to have the flexibility and the freedom to compete globally and act more like private corporations in that they want to be able to borrow money more easily and to make strategic investments rapidly to enable them to compete globally. I think that's an understandable perspective. And talking to the government and the minister, the focus of this legislation seems to be on public accountability. That is, moving port authorities and marine ports along that spectrum from fully arm's length corporate entities to more government and public accountability, particularly coming on the heels of the pandemic and the supply chain challenges that we've seen. So if the goal of this legislation before us is to move us along that spectrum towards more public accountability and more ministerial accountability, is that a direction that you support? And I'll put it to both of you, and with the hope of a short answer so that I can ask my other 9 questions.
Sure, if it's done properly, but adding 2, 3, five more spots to a Port Authority board that's going to be picked by different levels of government doesn't open up public accountability because the board of directors answers to nobody. But if you had somebody from my union or my friend's union or the ILA sitting on those Port Authority boards, we are the public. We will be drilled by the public. That will bring public accountability back. But people that sit in their ivory towers and come to a meeting once a month, that's not public accountability.
Monsieur Murray?
J'amende dans le même sens que
I agree with my colleague, Mr. Ashton. Just to get back to something that Rob was saying with regard to the presence of union reps on Port Authority boards, before the last amendment of the bill to the Act, the union reps were excluded from the boards. We had union reps on boards for 15 years, and this led to better communication. I would like to state once more that I have qualms. I have qualms with the fact that port authorities directors are appointed by government. Governments change, and then the appointments start anew. And then one person is invited to appoint and is appointed by one government and then the other government. So we need to ask ourselves a question: is this ideal for port authorities? Port authorities promote their ports, manage their infrastructure, makes their infrastructure accessible to vessels. This is what it does. It's a business. It must take measures to ensure that ports in Montreal and Vancouver remain attractive, and the political appointments don't go necessarily in that direction.
Ashton, some of the discussion today has focused on the emergency provisions that allow the minister to take pretty much any action he or she deems necessary in cases where there is a risk to the supply chain. And the wording is quite broad. I read it earlier in the meeting. And I think the concern that has very rightly been expressed is that those powers would be used inappropriately in the cases of collective bargaining or labor action. Is this something that you feel could be addressed with a simple amendment that creates a clear exemption for labor-related actions, or does it need a more thorough overhaul?
Oh, goodness. If the language is clean and plain and written so that a layman can read it, like myself, that might be all it needs. That this excludes labor relations. This excludes collective agreements. This protects our charter rights, and the government's going to stay out of collective bargaining. If it's clean, so a layman can read it and understand it, definitely.
Okay, and maybe the last question, it's a very simple one. We've had quite a discussion about the appointment of directors on Port Authority boards. Monsieur Murray, you voiced a concern about the change of government and the corresponding change in directors that can result. And the focus here really has been around the appointment of the board chair, and it seems there are two options. One is the appointment by the other directors on the board, and the other is the option that is presented in the bill, which is that the minister appoints the chair. Just to be clear, it's the former that you prefer as the appointment option, and perhaps I'll put this to both Mr. Ashton and Mr. Murray.
10-second response each, please.
Nécessairement pas la nomination par le ministre. Donc,
Not an appointment by the minister. There could be an appointment by the group.
Mr. Ashton?
I'm open to democracy. So if you want a chair, make it an election. Let somebody like myself put in for it, or somebody that represents another part put in for an election to be a board chair. But that has to be, we're allowed to be on the board of directors.
Thank you, Mr. Ashton. Merci, Mr. Murray. And thank you, Mr. Backrack. For the second round of questioning and our final round for today, we will go to Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. After Mr. Ashton's opening remarks, I pulled up the current board of directors for the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and I noted one notable fellow British Columbian, Ken Giorgetti. Ken Giorgetti has served for 15 years as the former president of the Canadian Labour Congress and was the president of the BC Federation of Labour, where he achieved significant legislative improvements for workers. As a British Columbian, we know that Ken Giorgetti, that name is legendary in the labour movement in our province and right across the country. So clearly the issue is not that there is no labour. I don't think Mr. Giorgetti has forgotten to stand up for workers just because he's not an active member of a union that is working at the port. So I guess that's my concern here, is that there's nothing preventing a government from appointing people that have a labor background. Obviously, the government of British Columbia recommended Mr. Giorgetti, and he was appointed in 2021. The question is whether active members of labor or active members of port users, should the Viterra president be able to sit on the board of directors? The answer would be no, because he would have an obvious conflict of interest because of his active involvement in the port. So if the issue is not that there's no labor representation, again, Ken Giorgetti is a guy who's going to fight for labor on that board. So is the issue not one of whether someone is an active participant in the day-to-day operations of the port? Is that not more of the consideration? And do you think that either labor or the business side could operate on the board of directors without being in a fairly obvious conflict of interest?
For both your statements there, we have Ken Giorgetti has a great history in the labor movement. I'll never take that from him. He's done amazing things for the workers of this country and my home province of British Columbia. Ken Giorgetti does not represent labor at the Port of Vancouver. He doesn't. He supported the building in RBT2, which is going to has a potential of destroying half my jobs in the Port of Vancouver. That's not what a labor rep does. A labor rep fights for workers' jobs. That's what a labor rep does. To your other suggestion about would it be a conflict of interest if an employer in the Port of Vancouver sits on the board, any Port Authority board, or if I sit or one of my people sit that's active on a Port Authority board? The simple answer is no. Because the Port Authority builds more things and is involved in more issues than just building of terminals that we represent workers under. Currently, the way the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is structured, they came almost dead last in that report that was put out. And you have a couple of port authorities that I mentioned that came in a little bit higher than they did, and they have workers that represent them on the boards. So active workers. And so, no, I don't think there would be a conflict of interest. And if one came up, I would expect that board member to recuse themselves for that one issue.
Okay, I appreciate that. You mentioned the summer. Obviously, you had a very contentious labor negotiation. Had you ever seen the solution that was proposed by the Minister of Labor used? Have you seen it used before? And if your members had not agreed to that contract, do you actually think it was a legal remedy to have the negotiator essentially impose a contract or say this is what the contract should be, with the threat? I think fairly obviously that would form the basis for back to work legislation if it was not utilized. So I know we're going a little off topic here, but I know you're a subject matter expert on it. How did you feel that at the end, when the minister imposed that solution, did you feel it was actually legal what he was proposing?
I'm not going to get into legalities of it. My members spoke loud and clear, and that's all that matters to me at the end of the day. My members said no because they wanted a freely negotiated collective agreement presented to them to vote on, and that first one was voted down by my membership. And my membership is always right. End of story. Now, when we freely negotiated the last collective agreement, the last terms of settlement that we brought to my membership, and my membership voted it up, again, my membership is always right. I'm not going to get into the legalities of that. I have a lawyer to do that.
Excellent. I don't know how much time I have, Chair.
You have 30 seconds, Mr. Strahl.
Okay. A final question then. You've mentioned Roberts Bank Terminal 2 numerous times. There's kind of two parts to that approval. One was to build a landmass, and the second part is what should be done on it. Do you reject the whole project out of hand, or do you think that the port could work with labor and others to increase the landmass and perhaps do something on it that would be more acceptable to your membership than another container port that is increasingly automated?
Very short response, please, Mr. Ashton.
In a nutshell, the way the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority went about and did it and ignored environmentalists and ignored community groups, yes, it's a flawed system, should not be built. If we had voice on the Port Authority board so we could have done it properly, definitely. But why build something that's just going to cause more issues in the supply chain and cause more glut on the railway tracks when we haven't figured out the current problem as it exists today?
Thank you, Mr. Ashton, and thank you, Mr. Strahl. Next, we have Ms. Koutrakis. Madame Koutrakis, la parole est à vous. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Koutrakis, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the friends we have today in the room who are coming to testify this evening. I believe that it's really important to state at this point that strikes are legal in Canada. Bill C-33 will not change anything in this regard. We already heard Mr. Bijimin talk about this. He was from Transport Canada. I sincerely believe that we need to be cautious here. We need to ensure that an opinion that is not correct does not prevail. I will ask Mr. Ashton 2 questions, and Mr. Murray as well. How would you describe your relationship with the port authorities at the moment? And do you believe that port authorities are listening to workers? Or do you believe that you have a hard time getting heard? And that has a relation to what I said at the very start. I'd just like to better understand, please. If you're referring to labor relations between unions and employers, because you're talking about the right to strike, our employer is the Association of Maritime Employers, just like for Rob, it's BCMEA. In the past, there were good labor relations between all parties. 20 or 30 years ago, this was the case. I think in the last 2 decades, our point of view is that there is a total disdain from the employer toward the people we represent. There are many legal measures that are taken. The millions that they have dwarf our union's budget. I would say that labor relations are difficult. When there is a proper thinking exercise done to who needs to be at a table, then this might change. When I'm at a table and I don't have decision makers there, this delays the process. I think that labor relations have been very tense for the last 20 years. There are no decision makers. And at this regard, I think the minister will have to examine the labor code to ensure that we can make representations to true decision makers. Instead, we do it to the voices of boards. We are the delegates. We are chosen by our employees, and this is a problem. We cannot speak to the decision makers. I was at the Port of Vancouver strike, and I saw that there was no marine transportation company that was at the table. These are people who are academics, basically. I have nothing against academics, but they are the ones who are there. We need to have companies at the table to be able to ensure that we're talking to decision makers. This might be a long process, and it might be difficult and it is making labor relations very difficult.
I do have a different question, but and I don't know how much time I have, Mr. Chair.
You have 2 minutes, 1 minute, 10 seconds.
Okay, so quickly, Mr. Ashton, if you would like to add your comments to those questions.
So the British Columbia Maritime Employers Association represents our employer groups, and they're separate from the port authorities in BC. But we've got 4 port authorities in BC. There should only be 3, to be honest with you. My relationship with the biggest one is really bad over the last 10 years because of their actions towards our union. The one up north, we've got pretty cordial relationship. We get along quite well. And one of the port authorities on Vancouver Island, we get along quite well. But honestly, why there's 2 port authorities on Vancouver Island, I couldn't tell you.
Okay. My next question is on this bill, C-33, contains a few measures to help with the coordination and logistics at Canada's ports. Do you think these changes will make it easier for employees to do their jobs, or do you foresee it making, I don't know, adding hurdles or, adding blockages to the fluidity or resilience of our supply chain? Because we heard,
please.
Working environment, right off the top of my head, I can't really see it. But if you're looking for data from the member companies for the Port Authority to give to the government of Canada, good luck, because the member companies that ship cargoes, that run the terminals and the railways, why are they going to give you private data to the Canadian government? Couldn't tell you. I don't think it'll work.
Thank you, Mr. Ashton, and merci, Madame Koutrakis. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Bars.
Next, Mr. Barsalou-Duval, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I wanted to get back to this issue of having a union rep on the board, or on the table at the very least. I found the concept interesting because of reasons. I feel that this is not necessarily in the North American business environment, but there are places around the world that have this, and the ports are not going bankrupt, so it could work. I just wanted to talk about a point that you raised earlier, and maybe you could give additional details on it. It would seem that it is difficult to talk with the employer, the true employer, because now, as a member, you have to speak to the Association of Maritime Workers, Marine Workers, but not necessarily in cases when but not necessarily to talk with port authorities directly. Is there a mechanism to correct this? Is there would the presence of a union rep on a board would allow union people to talk to decision makers with regard to everyday concerns? There are the Port Authority and the Association. These are two separate entities. I did say earlier that when there was legal action taken against the Longshoremen Union, we saw that these two have the same lawyers and they use the same tactics. They did it for a long time against us again in a labor tribunal. What I'm saying is that we're not talking to decision makers. The decision makers are not the port authorities or the association. It is the companies that do business in the port. Merck Canada, MSC, these are the companies that are on the boards. They are the true decision makers with regard to the negotiation criteria in these agreements, and we never have the opportunity to talk to them. The union never has the ability to talk about wages, productivity. We do not have the presence there. We do not have them in the room. We have these kinds of messengers that are here that, and we are asked to tell them our demands and our questions. It's ridiculous. We never have true decision makers in front of us. The true decision makers are not port authorities or associations. It is companies. I, as a union member, would ask someone how to increase productivity. We have ideas about this. We have ideas about how our members can better reconcile family and work lives and be better motivated and be more productive, but we are never able to speak to the true decision makers. Thank you, Mr. Murray and Mr. Basaluzval.
Mr. Bachrach, you have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the issues that I've heard concern expressed about from your organizations is around automation at our ports and the impact on workers. I know this was one of the issues that contributed to the recent strike, and it's a long-standing concern and a concern that I think is on a lot of port workers' minds. With the idea of having labor representation on Port Authority boards, how do you see that contributing in a positive way to the discussion about automation and mitigating the impacts on Canada's longshore workforce?
So it's quite simple, and I'm going to go back. I don't mind picking on RBT2. It's my thing, I guess, now. When the concept of RBT2 first came up, if there was labor rep from my union on the Port Authority board, we could have explained the concerns that we would have had, the decimation of the jobs that would have been created. And we could advise them on different ways to do business. Yes, ports and port authorities and terminals have to green the working environment. I understand that. But there's different ways to do it than bringing in robots and getting rid of Canadian jobs so that corporations can make a ton more money. This situation with RBT2 didn't have to happen if we were on the board of directors.
Monsieur Murray?
L'automatisation est un enjeu, je pense, planétaire.
Automation is an issue that we're seeing around the world, and it's a challenge for union reps and longshore men reps. It's something that was raised all around the world. Some people think that automation is a silver bullet. When I was 16, I was told that I would have to stop working at 50 years old and that I would have access to all kinds of fun things. This didn't happen. But with regard to automation, I would say that there were things done elsewhere. There were projects around the world, mainly in Europe. And these tests showed that automation was not an end-all solution. It did not make the entire supply logistics chain more resilient or improve productivity across the board. I believe, mainly in Montreal, I believe it's the same thing in Montreal, that people are better served by human employees who are dedicated to their work and have done it for years. I do not believe that automation is a silver bullet. Thank you, Mr. Murray.
We very much appreciate your time and your witness testimony this evening. With that, I will adjourn the meeting. And for those of you staying behind, we do have another meeting after this with the UK delegation. This meeting is adjourned.